Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning virtually and to be joined by the esteemed panel that is here with me today. So Nollaig O'Sullivan and Dr. Kara McGann. I am Davina Ramkissoon, Wellbeing Director from Zevo Health, and I'm responsible for leading out the strategic and evidence-based implementation of workplace wellbeing programs for our clients. Nollaig is our performance psychologist, and she joins us with over a decade's worth of experience spanning across intervention design, research in the areas of sports and exercise, and performance psychology. She's also a dab hand to taking all of that knowledge and skills and applying it to workplace wellbeing and designing out courses and training for our corporate clients. Kara joins us from Ibec, where she sole role there is Head of Social Policy. She provides strategic advice and support on diversity and inclusion, skills and labour market policy, and practices to Ibec member organisations. She's also an organisational psychologist, a psychotherapist, and has also worked in human resources as a human resources manager in industry, delivering lectures at undergraduate, postgraduate, and executive level. So welcome both and for joining us here today.
Thanks, Davina.
Morning.
So to give a bit of context as to how we're going to run this session, we recently ran an online survey and we were really interested in gauging the attitudes to work and well-being during COVID-19, but also looking at the long-term implications for what that means for us. So we've had 173 people complete that survey, and whilst the responses have mainly come in from Ireland, we've also seen responses come from England, Wales, New York, Malta, Bulgaria, Sweden, which is phenomenal. We've also seen a great representation of industry, from healthcare and wellbeing to tech, to construction, to manufacturing, to education, to public sector, to professional services. The list is endless, and it gives us a good idea of what people are feeling also in the different sectors. If you haven't yet completed the survey and you would like to, then we'll be sharing the link in the chat shortly, but we will be closing the survey at the end of today, and where we will be doing thorough analysis and writing up a comprehensive report, which will be downloadable and free from our website, and will also be going out in our monthly newsletter. So I'd like to extend my gratitude to everyone who has completed that survey, because it's going to form the basis of our panel discussion here. We hope that it will validate some of the individual experiences we're having as a collective, but also in that hope to provide further insight and strategies in how we plan to move forward. So the three kind of key areas that we'd be looking at today are just looking currently at our feelings on remote working, for those of us who haven't had to do this before, considering the implications of returning to a normal office environment, if that is the case for some of our clients and attendees on the call today, and also looking at the future implications of work. So we're going to try and cover quite a bit of ground today, but if you have any questions, then please feel free to put them in the chat, and our moderators will pass them our way so that we can leave a section for Q&A at the end. So I guess without further ado, Nollaig, we've been looking and we've been interested at how remote working has impacted wellbeing, both the positive and the negative. From the research that was conducted, we saw a range of reasons as to how people were benefiting from the remote working, which ranged from getting better sleep, being able to look after themselves, and the two key areas that came up were not commuting and being able to spend more time virtually with their friends, family, and have much more deeper connection and time to connect with them without being so tired. So that accounted for about 35% of the responses. And I'm interested to know your opinion and your views on how we maintain this sense of well-being and the thriving elements that have come out of it, as we look to kind of come out of the restrictions and return to where we can, structures and routines that we were once in before.
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for having me on today's talk, and even listening to Professor Jim, Lucy and Coleman earlier on. There were great learnings from it as well. I suppose if anybody knows me, they know that my key message over the 10 years, people would say to me, what's your key tip from all the psychology that you've learned? And my top tip is self-awareness. The minute that we become self-aware, then we can start implementing changes. If we're not aware that we're stressed, then how can we make changes? If we're not aware that we're a good communicator, then how can we make changes? And it's the same for this thriving. Why are we thriving? So it's becoming a little bit more aware and sitting down and writing out, well, why is it that I'm thriving? Is it thriving because now I'm exercising? Is it thriving because I've learned meditation? Is it thriving now because, from workplaces that, now I've learned to delegate. Now I've learned to deal with my stress. So the minute that we start writing down why we're thriving, not only are they going to help us now, but in the future, whenever we're faced with setbacks, we can use those valuable tools to put into the rest of our lives. So, what we're looking at here is, you might say to yourself, do you know what, I get really stressed, or I don't know how to delegate in the past. You've been forced into an environment where we have to delegate. And now you're probably seeing the benefits of that. So the very first step I would say is become aware of why you are thriving. Maybe you're getting a lot more exercise, but maybe the way you're working is different. And the second step I'd say is reevaluate your goals now. Look at, okay, now I know why I'm thriving. So how can I implement that into the future? So for instance, you might find you're thriving because the minute your working day finishes now, you close your laptop and you go downstairs and you don't look at work again till the following morning. Whereas previously, you might have finished work, you might have jumped into the car, you might have said, you know what, I'll catch up on phone calls here. And you could be sitting outside your house, still finishing that work phone call. Your kids are inside looking out at you. You finally get in home, but that spillover from work has built into your family life. So maybe it's like setting goals for yourself that, do you know what, the next time I go back into the work, give myself 10 minutes of sitting in the car, doing meditation, writing out a list of stuff that I had to do tomorrow, de-stressing, and even kind of going, you know what, I'm just taking 10 minutes out, that when I go back in home, that is my social life then. So it's about understanding why we're thriving and setting new goals in place.
That's great. It is really important. Self-awareness is key to that emotional resilience. And I think it's also just important to recognize our needs will change as we've all felt as we've adapted to this situation. And Kara, I think, we're naturally inclined to thrive, but there's quite mixed feelings on returning to the office. And from the survey, we had 50% feeling anxious, apprehensive, or stressed about the potential to returning to their office working environments. I have to mention as well that there were 25% who were feeling quite happy about being able to get back into that routine and normality, I'm sure, and have that separation between home and work. And Ibec have laid out a very thorough process and plan to help employers help manage the process of returning back to work in a health and safe way. However, from an employer's perspective, if they are looking to engage their employees in communication around that conversation in returning to the office, what should they consider when meeting, the anxious, the apprehensive, the stressed employee? What strategies or tools should they be engaging in and considering when opening up those conversations?
Morning, everybody. I think it's a really interesting thing to find exactly what you found in the survey, and it's great to see that. I think with the apprehensive employee, we've got to start building on what many employers have been already doing during this whole time of lockdown, which is communicate and collaborate. One of the really strong things I think for me that has come out of this crisis is the willingness on both employer and employee side to work together to figure out how we're going to do this. and that's been really strong. And I think we've got to approach the return to the workplace. I know many haven't left the workplace, but for those of us who have, I think we've got to approach that apprehension and that apprehension around returning in the same way as we've been communicating so far. So I think it's about talking to our employees very, very clearly about what is the plan. You know, their apprehension isn't unreasonable. It's, you know, it's absolutely normal to be feeling apprehensive about this and maybe lacking in a little bit of confidence about how we're going to successfully do this and what does this mean for my safety and that of my loved ones. So I think starting off with the plan and communicating the plan to our employees around our return to work protocol. How have we adapted that for our workplace? What does that mean in terms of cleaning, in terms of social distancing? Maybe we're going to stagger times in the canteen. Maybe we're going to stagger, you know, the start and end times of people. It looks like we might be kind of a little bit like where we hear about the childcare, the pods. It sounds like in many of our workplaces, we'll kind of have our own pods of our teams that we will work with and maybe go to the canteen with or whatever, and that we will be slightly distant maybe from some of our other colleagues in that way. It's not perfect, but the more we know about the plan, the more reassured we can be that you know, safety and cleaning protocols, you know, the different requirements that we need to have in place to make sure that we can do this effectively are there. I think at the same time, we've got to make sure that we point to where the supports are. So if somebody is feeling concerned, you know, do we have mental health champions in our workplace? You know, who is in our HR team that we can contact? I think we also need to make sure that our line managers are really well trained in this area and are really up to speed as to what the plans are and how we're going to navigate this, because oftentimes they'll be the first point of contact for their team, or equally they might notice in their teams somebody who's maybe not doing as well with this whole plan for return. So I think a lot of communication, collaborating with our employees to make sure that we know where they're coming from and how that's working out for them, and then looking to the supports that we might have, whether it's an employee assistance program and various other areas within that. Because I think what's happening is, you know, we've got to accept, as I say, that this apprehension is perfectly normal. But back to Nollaig's point about the awareness, you know, once we have the self-awareness about that and what we're going to do about it, it'll stand us in good stead going forward.
Definitely, and I think you made a very good point there around the collaboration process. Just in when we contrast with workplace wellbeing programs, it's not possible for an employer necessarily to make an employee well. So just as well, you know, there's a collaboration process in what each party does. So what would you say if I was an employee feeling this way, feeling anxious and apprehensive? What are my obligations, or what are my steps that I can take to help ease those feelings as well?
I think maybe a starting point is to acknowledge them as being probably how many of your colleagues are feeling, that you're not on your own in this.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't know, was it Coleman or Jim earlier was talking about how, you know, this uncertainty can be very, very much where the seat of our apprehension is coming from. And so to make sure that we're getting that confident return, it's informing ourselves about, you know, how it's going to be, asking the questions, you know, making sure that you have all the information that you need, that will hopefully provide some reassurance. But then if that's not doing it, secondly, I'd be looking to the past. I'd be looking to, you know, when faced with difficult situations in the past, what resources did you draw on? You know, you've come through crises, you've come through difficult situations, albeit not identical to this one. This one is fairly unusual, but in the same way as you've come to crises and difficult situations before, what did you do? What resources did you draw on to approach them? And then thirdly, I would be seeking out supports in terms of the EAP system, the Employee Assistance Programme, or other talking supports to really work through what's at the root of that apprehension and what can we do about it. Mm-hmm. It is important, though, that you know, to bring it up with your employer, and it's equally important that employers are open to that, because this isn't a typical situation, as you say. And I know Coleman mentioned hating the new normal terminology, but it kind of is somewhat, you know, this is how it's going to be for some time. It is the new normal in that sense. So we've got to figure out how we're going to work with it.
Mm-hmm. And just with figuring out, a lot of trial and error comes about So I think it's not being too hard on ourselves if we do perceive ourselves to be failing or not hitting the mark. I think I especially like what you said there. In essence, there's a roadmap for an employer and their processes and the communication and the support services and offer, but it might just be as simple as mapping that out for an individual as an employee to say, these are your sources of support as well that are still open to you. This is how to maybe address an ambiguous situation. These are your designated POCs in the company, because we do know from our expertise that exposing yourself and feeling vulnerable in the workplace is one of the hardest things to get your head around and to do. But I think naturally with the pandemic, what has happened is a lot of that vulnerability has organically transpired. People are having the conversations, and it's not just how are you, yeah, I'm grand, as we would say in Ireland. It's how are you, and it's like, yeah, I'm actually struggling a bit today, or I've just been on VC calls all day and I'm exhausted. Yeah, so Nollaig, I guess in that way as well, we looked at the sources of stress that were being experienced, and outside of the uncertainty, outside of the distractions that we have from working in our personal spaces, and the sense of isolation and knowing how that impacts mental health and resilience detrimentally, what's coming up is this feeling of being less productive than usual. So I'm really interested to hear, you know, from the performance psychologist in you, why do you feel that this might be occurring at this moment in time?
Yeah, so I suppose when we look at productivity and we look at, you know, since COVID-19 has started, we have been inundated with, you know, anxiety-inducing news. We've been inundated with this idea of, we have loads of extra time. What will we do with all this extra time? And I know for myself, I have less extra time than I've ever had before. And it's about understanding that, you know, we are probably getting pulled from every different direction. We're probably losing our focus. And that's really understandable. Like, how can we be productive when we have kids, you know, roommates or inner critics screaming in the background? And I suppose one of the key things, and you probably have heard Coleman and Jim talking about there, is that, you know, this isn't the time for, you know, it's difficult to be productive during this time. We have been bombarded with hurdles of emotions, and we're finding it really uncertain how to deal with those emotions. You know, how will we navigate our way through them? But on top of that, then we're spending so much mental expenditure on now being a parent, being a teacher, being a worker, being a carer, that it's just adding on to all these different levels of emotions. So when we look at how we can look at our productivity, I suppose from different points of view, you know, we all process emotions different. We're all under different circumstances. But I suppose the very first thing that I would say is to label these emotions. Label them. Say, you know what, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling lonely. And sharing that with your friends, your family, because I can guarantee you people are feeling the exact same way. Like, over this time, I've never heard so many people talking about their emotions and how they're feeling. So I think number one, label it and talk to your friends about it. But number two, the other thing that I'd say is do what you can do. You know, the very first thing I would say is foundational self-care is priority. It's your first priority. Today, you could be very creative, you could be innovative. Tomorrow, you might have absolutely no motivation to be productive, and that's okay. It's about taking a day by day experience, you know, and you're not meant to be, you know, managing on all four cylinders at the time. You do what you can do. And maybe it's a case of today, yep, I'll go for a run, I'll go for a walk, and I'll be really productive. But then tomorrow you might be like going, I don't have that. I don't have it. And maybe as Professor Jim Lucy said there, maybe even just going, do you know what, I go to bed tonight early. I go to bed early, and that's for my well-being. So it's about not being so hard on yourself and allowing it. And if you're somebody who likes a few goals, you know, go about setting small, manageable goals and practice self-compassion. Because when you practice self-compassion for yourself and go, do you know what, in my opinion, I feel that during coronavirus, all shoulds should be taken out of the dictionary. Because when we look at shoulds, I should be a better parent, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. They just bring about guilt in us. You know, they're being about, I should be doing this. No, we shouldn't, because there's no written rules for how we're coping now. So just do what you can do the best. Set small goals if that's something that you can achieve, but make sure they're achievable and relatable to you as well.
Definitely, definitely. Really important points there to note. And I think it's also important to recognize the way we work is changed. We don't have our normal cues for breaks, whether it's walking from one meeting to the next, getting a coffee, having those conversations which provide natural breaks in our day. Our work is very much just focused at looking at our laptops or looking at our laptops to our phones, and we're using the same resources, and that's draining. So I think in that as well, it's a point of considering our ability to switch off and how we're switching off, and considering as well, now that we're working out of our homes, work-life balance. And there's, from my research as well, that term has been not so well received from the psychologist side of things, to say, is it the right term we should be using? Work-life integration has been thrown out as an alternative. But in essence, we're always trying to achieve the best. The ability to keep clear boundaries between work and home life is more challenging than ever, and especially when you've got your laptop nearby, or you've got access to your emails at the touch of your hand. And so Kara, I think maybe on that side of things, is there a way in which we can rethink the way we work? Is there an opportunity to consider task completion, perhaps, over quantity of hours spent at the laptop? But I'm interested to hear your thoughts around how work itself might evolve.
Sure. You know, I think if there's to be a silver lining from this crisis, for me, this would be one of them. Because I think what it has done is, let's take flexible working and remote working and so on. For many organizations, the perception of remote working and of flexible work was always seen as a taboo. You know, you potentially weren't committed to your career if you were going to engage in that, or it wasn't possible at this level within the organization or in this type of work. And the crisis forced our hand, and many discovered it really does work, and people are productive, and people have flexed in this area, and it's worked out really well. But I suppose also we've noted that, exactly to your point, learning how to disconnect, learning how to put boundaries in place, to actually be able to manage when we are working, that we're working, but when we're not working, that we really are not working. Because the temptation, and I, you know, I've had to change where I put my mobile phone, for example, because if it buzzes, you know, the notification of a new email, the temptation to check at 10 o'clock at night, you know, is there, where it, you know, maybe if I was working in the office, I'd have it away, but now, you know, home is office, so there's a little temptation there. I also think we have to tread carefully though with this, because as valuable as the idea of output-based working is, and it's absolutely the way we're seeing people, I suppose, embracing and seeing how that productivity is coming through, it in itself doesn't just happen automatically. At the moment, obviously, this isn't exactly how you'd start from here. You know, you wouldn't necessarily start from here, but we're managing it at the moment. But I think going forward, we'll need to put in place good policies and practices to make sure that everybody is on the same page as to how actually output-focused work works. So in the sense that, you know, that people know what the goals and objectives are. The worst thing that could happen is that one person's working to an output-focused approach and the other person is still hanging on to those presenteeism issues that you would have had in the organization and is judging them by a different set of rules. That's not going to work for anybody. So I think it's very important that if that's the approach we take, and it's a really important approach that we should take, you know, that we make sure we put the parameters around that and make sure that everybody's clear about those parameters so that we can do this really effectively and really successfully. I also think we need to be careful though, because this way of working isn't going to suit everybody. And we have heard from a number of employees who just can't wait to get back to, you know, the workplace as it was, you know, to that camaraderie within the office that they feel they're missing out on. As good as virtual is, it's nothing like being able to go to the canteen together. And okay, that might be a little ways down the road for us, but certainly that you know, there are people who aren't thriving in this way of working and who will need a hybrid. And you know what, that's okay. I think the future of work, if anything this has taught us, is we have to be open to looking at different ways of doing it. We've now proved that it can be done differently, and I really hope that we don't slip back and that we don't lose that, but allowing for, we need new rules around how we manage our time, how we keep those boundaries in place, and how we disconnect when we're not working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really valid points there. And it comes back to most things in life, the boundaries, the policies. How is one manager enforcing and working to those expectations versus another in the organization? And it's a great time to rethink the way we've traditionally worked and consider ways in which were considered not to be productive, but as we've shown are now very productive. And interestingly enough, you know, we had 80% of the survey request and say that they wanted to have a hybrid solution. So just recognizing that people do want to still have a sense of, you know, remote working, but still have the social impact of being back in the office. So that's going to hopefully be another change that will play out. And I think as well, when we look at how people have gained positive change in their life, there'll be a sense of perhaps loss or grieving for what they currently have as they look at going back to their old routine and old structure. And Kara, I'm considering how, with your background in the diversity and inclusion, with the remote working, how that would play out. How do we inform and live best practice when we are separated, you know, by a greater distance now?
I think the diversity inclusion piece is very important, because there's a real risk with a crisis that it will slip off our agenda. What we're finding is that companies where it's very much embedded in the culture have just continued, you know, it hasn't slipped whatsoever. But we're also seeing others very mindful of how do they keep it on the agenda. You know, if we go back to other big crises, I suppose, like World War II was the first time women who had children came into the labour force. Mm-hmm. So, you know, a crisis can bring opportunity, and I think that's how we need to approach it. What we have seen is that, you know, we've got to keep our eye on the ball with it, because if there's any let up on our focus, we can see really unintended consequences coming through. We see, for example, racism just below the surface, as was shown in the Keelings situation. We can see that people, let's say, with disabilities, you know, talking about their concerns, some with a physical disability being concerned about going outside in case they fall and what will happen. Others talking with hearing impairment, talking about the difficulty with masks and how that's playing out for them out in the wider world. So for both customers and employees, you know, employers have to be really very much on top of this. We also know that diversity and inclusion is so important to creativity and innovation, and my goodness, if we don't need that now, we've never needed it before. But I think what we're seeing is maybe having to look at how do we do that differently. So we would have in Ibec a diversity forum and a very active forum of members who this is an agenda item for them. And one of the things they're always exploring is how do we do that differently now? So some have, for example, taken Pride celebrations and made them into virtual celebrations this year. So, okay, they're not going to be at the march, but they're going to be still celebrating Pride. Others have looked at ally programs. So, for example, around things like racism, you know, noticing that, you know, in the banter as things are loosened because we're not in the workplace, making sure that nothing slips in, and so reinforcing their you know, messages around that inclusion policy, that importance of it, and of being an ally. others looking at, you know, putting parenting programs online and doing things virtually this way, more really focusing in. And I suppose a huge area that has been focused in is on the mental health and well-being space, and a lot of attention being given to that. And again, I suppose the second silver lining for me is that we have people talking about mental health now in a way that they never did before. So diagnosis or no diagnosis, everybody has finally recognized that we all have mental health and it can fluctuate over time. And that's great. And we're having a lot more, as you said, conversations that go beyond grand. You know, how are you? Grand. You know, and we're getting to get to that more and more. So I think all those aspects of diversity and inclusion are really important. One area, I suppose, that I have some concerns about are the unintended consequences of the reopening, as we've seen, particularly the impact that it may have on gender balance. So where creches and schools haven't reopened, and there's a care issue in dual career couples, a decision is possibly going to have to be made as to who's going to do the caring role and who's going to go back into the workplace. And we've got to navigate through that with our employees, because the worst thing for me to see happening is an erosion of all of the progress we've seen over the years to get to a greater level of gender balance, and to lose that, because as we know by research, more often than not, the care element falls to women rather than men. So for me, that one is one that's very foremost, I suppose, in my mind, as we kind of navigate through this.
And it's hard right now, I imagine, to map down robust processes until we get to that next stage and understand what it actually means for each family unit, and how an organization might need to tailor their approach to supporting each one of their employees in that process. I really believe that the diversity and inclusion agenda is just as it needs to be addressed just as much as everything was building up before. So it would be a shame to see that lost. Nollaig, I know you've been delivering the mental health champion trainings, and just hearing the feedback around the aha moments, the sense of, oh, this is normal, the disruption of that sense of the stigma that's risen naturally throughout time. I'd be interested if you'd be able to share some of that feedback and some of the experiences that you've had whilst delivering that, and just the worth of an organisation investing in it in a way.
Yeah, I suppose one of the key things when we created the mental health champion as well was, not only is it to deliver it to how we can support someone within the workplace, but a lot of it is built around our coping strategies as well. And I think for this, and the from it is, you know, how can we have that conversation around? Because sometimes do we feel like, are we better off saying nothing at all, or should we approach the person? So a lot of the training that we do is about opening up that conversation and how we can have that. So I think for that really provides individuals with, I suppose, key tools. And that's a lot of it with the training it does, is provides those key tools. We also provide the information of how we help somebody through a crisis. How do we approach the person? But also, I suppose, one of the biggest aha moments is for people is that they kind of say, okay, I didn't realize that I didn't have to problem solve. So a lot of people feel the pressure of, okay, how do I solve this person's problem or what they're going through? But it's not about that. It's about being there for the individual, supporting them, and then signposting them to the relevant professional individuals. So a lot of people will get caught up with, oh, do you know what, I need to help this person, but it's about supporting them. And I think one of the other key messages that we find as well is, you know, that it's key to have our own mental health coping strategies, whether that's exercise, whether that's meditation. And I think even through the training, it just provides a little bit of a, you know, coming back to yourself, kind of going, actually, do you know what, I don't really have many mental health coping strategies that I implement. So they're kind of the key areas that we find from the mental health champion training.
Excellent. And I think one of the themes that listening to you both speak about just there on the topic of diversity, inclusion and mental health is validating the emotions and providing those spaces for discussion. A lot of managers may be feeling like they need to, as you said, Nollaig, have all the tools, know how to solve all the problems. But a lot of the time, their presence is enough to help an employee, one of their direct reports, just feel heard, feel seen, feel cared about, feel noticed, and feel part of, you know, the bigger picture within the organization. And I think just, you know, we probably have managers who are listening in now. And Kara, I might just come to you with your psychotherapist hat on. Just the impact of the emotional residue at times that can be left when you do support someone through a difficult time. It's really important then to backtrack and still remember that you need to still look at your own resources so that you're not depleted and potentially lead to burnout. And so how does a manager or anyone in a support function role look to ensure that they maintain their own well-being to better able lead their teams?
Sure. You know, it's like when you see on the airplane, put your own mask on first.
Yeah.
You know, you can't support somebody else if you're not self-care. You know, if you're not, as you say, backtracking and looking after your own well-being. So we've seen a number of employers put together almost support groups of their mental health champions. So that's an outing, not to discuss anybody, but to support each other in, you know, how they're feeling, how it is, you know, how is it for them to be a champion in this area, and maybe to reinforce exactly what Nollaig says. They're not there to fix the problem, they're there to support, and to remember that. I do think it's something that is really important, and I suppose what we've always encouraged is setting up structures that those champions themselves have access to supports, you know, that they have maybe external supports, whether it's through our employee assistance program or our mental health first aid network, to really look at how they can support each other and what tools are there for them. Because, you know, the worst outcome of this is that they are in any way impacted by trying to care for colleagues, you know, within the organization and be there for them. So I think it is about providing a channel of communication within the organization, but sometimes also with outside of the organization, for those managers, to make sure that they are feeling that, you know, reassured in what they're doing, because sometimes it can be the worry that you've said the wrong thing or that you've done the wrong thing. But as Nollaig says, sometimes it is literally, it's being there and being empathic to somebody and helping somebody feel heard, you know, as the first step, and then, you know, directing them if necessary to further supports. So really, really important to look after those people.
Definitely, and I think it's even more apparent with the remote working conditions, and as Coleman and Professor Jim Lucy spoke about, that social connection piece, those avenues for natural sources to just debrief, to vent, to let it out, they're gone. So it's more of an effort, a concerted and conscious effort, to ensure that we're linking in with our support networks in work, and also growing those outside of work. So linking in with, again, perhaps the EAP, getting a bit of time just to process what you may be feeling, and also recognizing as well that we're all going through this at the same time, so we're all experiencing a lot of change, a lot of unknown, and we always look to the leadership team for that strong perspective and guidance on what to do next. But I think it's okay to say, I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to listen and be here and to listen to what's happening, what's coming up for you, and I'll do what I can to support you, and we'll get further support later down the line as well. So I think we're coming up to the end of the session. I'm going to ask you both one closing question. Considering we've gone through such unprecedented, and I believe that word has been overused at this point as well, similar to the new normal, unprecedented change, something we wouldn't have even, you know, really predicted would have happened at the beginning of the year. We saw it happening over in Wuhan, but maybe didn't take it as seriously until it got to our shores in March. So I'm interested to know, based on all the distress, the upheaval, the change, the difficulties we're going through at this moment in time, what do you believe may be a lasting outcome, a positive lasting outcome, whether it's to the way we work, whether we engage with our well-being in work, society, the way we care for ourselves and each other? Like, very broad question, but open to hear where you may believe we may be, that we have some opportunity for lasting change.
Yeah, I suppose we kind of in the past have delivered positive mental health, just 1 hour talks on it, and I would be going into organizations, and one of the top tips is about social connection. And when we look at that social connection, it's always up on the top findings when we look at resilience, when we look at happiness, when we look at mental health. And I would have always been in the past going, do you know what, stop being so busy and make time for your friends and your family, like, you know. And I don't think I need to be stressing that as much after this talk, because I think we now know the importance of that social connection, the importance of that we don't always have to be leaving the house to be going here, there, and everywhere, that our kids are happy sometimes in the back garden when they're playing with their friends, and maybe to slow down and just actually connect with the people that we love as well and being around. I think that's what's going to be a big, big change.
Yeah.
For me, I think related to exactly what Nollaig has said, you know, we've heard a lot of talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and people being impacted that way from the crisis. But the other side of that is this post-traumatic growth, this idea that people have taken some time out to actually reflect on, you know, what's not, you know, what's important, really important to me. And we've actually found in many cases that we've scaled back from the things that we thought we needed, the things that we thought were important, back to, as Nollaig says, that social connection, back to a different level of balance within our lives, and back to looking at, well, prioritizing, what do I really need to be focusing on, and actually what can I let go of? And for me, you know, as a positive outcome of this, that's certainly one for me.
Wonderful. That's been great chatting to you both, and we've covered a lot of ground in this short time. I think we could have spent all day unpicking these themes in greater detail. So thank you very much for providing your insights. And I'm just going to check quickly, do we have time for a Q&A? Maybe just this one question that's come in, just coming back to the diversity point and how to celebrate Pride virtually. I'm wondering, maybe Kara, could I send that?
Yeah, of course, certainly. We've seen a number of plans that people are putting in place now, and they've ranged from really simple things like on your list of names, you know, that come up on our calls and so on. The company has put a rainbow symbol around it just to mark through this month for Pride. Others are bringing virtual sessions together where they'll have role models in the LGBT plus community, talking about their experiences and sharing their experiences. Others are looking at doing different, almost like a socially networked event, with colleagues to mark Pride again in the way that they sometimes would have done within the organisation. They're now going to take it virtually and run different talks and pieces through that. So people really just wanting to put a real focus on that it's, you know, it's still as important as ever, even though we can't be maybe together for it.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great, Kara. I think we're out of time now, but if there are any questions that we didn't get to, we'll have a look through everything and we'll put some blog posts together, I'm sure, and just address some of those questions. So thank you everyone for joining us, and to Kara and to Nollaig for being here on the panel.
Thanks very much. Take care.